Greetings, welcome to our Chapter 1 lecture for counseling alcohol and other drugs. This is the history and etiological models of addiction. This is from our Capuzzi book. We're going to look at a history of addiction counseling. Addiction counseling is a specialized field in counseling. The profession evolved like medicine, psychology, and social work. So basically there was a need in the field. When we get to work a little more on 12-step and we look at Alcoholics Anonymous, really the way that the field looked at substance abuse was it was a moral disorder, is what we're going to look at a little later in this slideshow, but it evolved from self-help groups. It evolved in hospitals where after deinstitutionalization, which you'll learn more about in abnormal psychology, but the field kind of grew out of a need. There was a need for specialized counseling, and this was during a time when social workers more specifically worked with your inner city, your metropolitan agencies, and for social welfare more than therapy. And also before there were what we call now professional counselors or licensed professional counselors. The early practice was based on personal experience. There was a time when licensure was not required, and also no degree was required to be a licensed chemical dependency counselor. There are LCDCs that I've worked with in the field who are grandfathered in based on their experience. And then also there were special programs inside the prisons for people who had issues with addiction to be able to get their chemical dependency studies to be able to work as addiction counselors as part of their recovery program. So you'll see that there's a real dynamic move one direction from licensure to licensure and then back to experience again. When we talk about this, we talk about a history of prevention in the United States. If we look at the way that this looks at is alcohol was highly regarded in the colonies. Of course, we know temperance as moderation in the early 1800s, and the goal of temperance became abstinence from 1825 to 1850, and then the Volstead Act and prohibition from 1920 to 1933. So goal of temperance became abstinence, and basically there was a social movement for there to be a change or a limitation in society of how much alcohol could be consumed. The culmination of the second wave of temperance activity by women was passage of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, which took effect in 1920. Carrie Nation, which is what the actual project was called. Women got the vote in 1919 with the 19th Amendment. The Volstead Act, which reinforced the prohibition of alcohol in the United States of America, was popularly named after Andrew Volstead, who was the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, which oversaw its passage. However, Volstead served as the legislation sponsor and facilitator rather than its author. It was the anti-saloon leagues and Wayne Wheeler who convinced and drafted the bill. And this was meant to curb public drinking of alcohol. And really what it wound up doing was it wound up pushing the manufacturing and consumption of alcohol into the underground market. While prohibition was successful for reducing per capita or public consumption of alcohol and some of the problems related to drinking in its time, of course this was before and during the beginning of vehicles for drinking and driving was not necessarily an issue, but what was considered a wet society or wet areas, even what we now call red light districts, certain areas in different metropolitan areas where alcohol was regularly consumed. Its social turmoil or people's basic disagreement with the lack of civil liberties from their abilities to be able to purchase alcohol resulted in the repeal of that law in 1933. And then as we look and we go on from the way that around the time of Prohibition, the 1920s, we looked at most U.S. drug laws are influenced by class and ethnicity. It's important to keep in mind that until 1903, that cocaine was used in soda drinks such as Coca Cola. There were not what we see today with Walgreens and CVS and other pharmacies on every corner. Back then, a doctor would have mail order different procurements that they would get, and then there would be traveling salesmen or traveling doctors. We would call them medicine men per se. That would have a cart that was racked full of different type of medicines and such, and many times these medicines contained either some type of opiate, heroin, or cocaine, or some other type of substance. They would often commonly be called elixirs. Coca Cola was originally a elixir type medicine. Early laws required labeling and taxed opium and coca in 1906 and 1914. Then we look at the Controlled Substance Act in 1970. There's also the Pure Food and Drug Act of, I think it's 1913, that was in there. And so you see in the early turn of the century, the beginning of the change as far as what is being regulated. More specifically, the target here was opium and cocaine, or coca, the extract, which becomes cocaine. The Anti-Drug Prevention Act of 1986 created the United States Office of Substance Abuse Prevention, OSAP. This office consolidated alcohol and other drug prevention initiatives under Alcohol, Drug Abuse, and Mental Health Administration, or ADAMA, which ADAMA mandated that states set aside 20% of their alcohol and drug funds for prevention efforts, while the remaining 80% could be used for treatment programs. The Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, Prevention, and then it eventually became SAMHSA, which is the current formation of that organization, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, SAMHSA. You're going to hear me say SAMHSA a lot during this class. And also CSAP, Center for Substance Abuse Prevention. When you all heard me in the first class talk about the TCU IBR being funded, it was funded by CSAP, which is Center for Substance Abuse Prevention. There's a lot of acronyms in this class, so be prepared for them. As you see on this page, there are 3 acronyms. There's NIAAA, National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, formed in 1971. NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, which has some great studies, and some of the best neurological studies come from NIDA. The Anti-Drug Abuse Prevention Act of 1986, of course, is what came up with the ability for these agencies to come together and to have funding to do the type of studies and things. Policies to prevent addiction, the limits on age, of course, there was a big thing in the war, the Vietnam War, where the drinking age was 21. Soldiers were being drafted at 18 and would go to war and would not be of legal age to drink. So the drinking age was dropped down to 18 in most states, and then eventually raised to 19 in the 70s, and then in the 80s, most and now all states. I believe except for Alabama. There may be a few who still have the 19-year-old drinking age, but most states nationwide have a 21-year-old drinking age. Again, there's that whole concept of someone who's old enough to fight for our country and then shouldn't die fighting our country, or someone who is in the military who's at service. If they're under 21, shouldn't they have the right to drink? That's always, I think, going to be an ethical debate. The main policies to prevent continued addiction is taxation and control of distribution, is what we see with tobacco and alcohol. A more government focus on preventing use than treating addiction, and then SAMHSA reauthorized in 2000 for funding for co-occurring disorders. So SAMHSA, and when you look at someone who has a substance abuse disorder, in most cases they can either be comorbid because the substance abuse causes psychiatric issues, or they can have psychiatric issues and use substance as a coping mechanism. Some models for explaining etiology of addiction is the moral model, that someone can change by their belief system; psychological models, that someone can change through psychopharmacology or through therapeutic counseling; family models, which shows, much like intervention, that someone's key addiction issues come from family issues; disease model, which parallels drugs drug abuse and alcoholism to other disorders, chronic diseases such as your bipolar. I'm sorry. I am trying to think of high blood pressure, diabetes, those type of things. Biological models which show that it's mostly hereditary or that it's inherited. Sociocultural models that our society inhibits or that society helps to cultivate addiction. And then multi-causal models, which is kind of a collection of all of these together. The moral model says that personal choice is because somebody wants to use drugs is the reason why they do it. No biological basis. Religious beliefs of sinfulness is here. Basically, that people who fall prey to or people who use drugs should be punished in the legal system. There is a social stigma with the moral model because basically it doesn't have any input for someone actually having an issue as a result of something that's uncontrollable. The cravings are, on the moral model, it's said that cravings should be controllable and people should be able to control their urges based on their belief system. The psychological models is cognitive behavioral models, which is that someone is seeking pleasure, motivation, and that they're reinforced by the effects psychologically that the drugs has on the pleasure pathways. Also that there are positive and negative results, and that if someone has enough negative results, i.e. Problems with work, if you look at your DSM, it will help you to understand this. Problems with work, other types of issues with legal, family, all of those things, that if there's enough negative that the person will cease using drugs. And then the learning models, which shows that that someone uses a learned response. Aversion to withdrawal leads to prolonged use. In order to experience variety, to experience pleasure, to do decrease discomfort, and then someone has a usage pattern that is becomes more difficult to break. Also in the psychological models is psychodynamic models, where there's an underlying psychopathology, some type of ego deficiencies, inadequate parenting. It's mostly a personality issue. Problem with regulation to affect, as far as if someone is bipolar, they may use methamphetamine to come up from their low, or they may use some type of tranquilizer to come down from their high. And we're not talking about drugs that are prescribed, we're talking about self-medication when it relates to a substance abuse problem. As well as disturbed object relations, as far as not having a good orientation to their interaction with different items in their environment. And then the personality theory models, the alcoholic personality is someone who's dependent, immature, impulsive, emotional, unable to express anger, etc. These theories are not substantiated. In other words, they are just theories. There's no research to prove that any of these psychological models are effectively true or that they would be a good basis for treating someone. Family models, behavioral. Behavior is reinforced by family members, i.e. enablers. And when you take addictive family intervention, you'll hear a lot about the different family roles and such. Family systems, roles in family, changes are threatening, identified patient, and then it's a family disease. And that if one person, the addict, is sick in the family, that the rest of the family also feels the pain from the addict, and that in order for the family to become well, that the addict needs to be well, and it's a good process. If you ever have a chance to watch 28 Days with Sandra Bullock, it's an excellent film that shows some repressed issues from her childhood as it relates to her mother's alcoholism and how it affected her in adulthood. And it's a light drama comedy, but it's a really good, and we show that in our treatment groups at the facility that I work at. Next is the disease model. It's one of the most popular models. It shows that addiction is a primary disease. There's no moral stigma. It's just like having high blood pressure or diabetes. It came out from Benjamin Rush. E.M. Jellinek from 30s to 40s came up with is credited, but the writings of Benjamin Rush were first irreversible Progression of stages does not always occur. Originally, alcohol was generalized not to cover other drugs, and then original research questioned the use of alcohol. So in the first studies on the disease concept, there were no women in those studies. It was of 158 questionnaires, and 60 of them were discarded. So it was a research study. It was very light, not very realistic or even reliable, but it did start the path on the way of being used, and disease model has come to the forefront, especially when we talk about Alcoholics Anonymous and 12 Steps. A lot of the weight behind what's seen to be a restorative process in those type of groups is because of the background in the disease concept. It says that there are progressive stages. Prodromal, or the beginning, middle, crucial, or chronic, early, middle, late stages of addiction or alcoholism. Shows that it's chronic and incurable, abstinence required, which is where your tie-in to Alcoholics Anonymous comes in, because anytime someone's in Alcoholics Anonymous, they do not say, I was an alcoholic, they say, I am an alcoholic, and that's where the incurable part comes in. Treatable, but not curable, something that someone will have to work on for the rest of their life to avoid relapse and to stay not just sober but in recovery. And again, the original research on that was questioned. Next is the biological model, the genetic models, strong statistical associations, where adopted children more closely resemble biological parents than the adoptive in use of alcohol. What that means is if someone is, twins are born and one twin is separated, and the twin that is separated lives in a home where alcohol is abused, if their parents, genetics, did not use alcohol, if they were not genetically predisposed, then they have a lighter or a less chance of falling prey to alcoholism based on their genetic predisposition not being that they're not predisposed to alcoholism. And we'll talk much more lengthy about the hereditary and how that all works in future chapters. The neurobiological models, the limbic system and brain chemistry changes with use, and that's going to show where we see brain scans and such that show the changes in the brain, and how once a chemical is introduced that the neural pathways are depleted of certain chemicals, norepinephrine and other type of chemicals that are in the brain, dopamine and such, and we will talk more at length about that as well. Those are important things for you to know for your LCDC exam. Sociocultural models, which shows that context influences drug definitions, use, and effect. Supracultural, cultures, collective attitudes impact addictions. Alcohol is seen as an acceptable drug. Other social expectations. And then we look at the research that is there from Bales and Bacon that showed that the culture's view of alcohol is that it is acceptable in moderation. It also is notable to show that most recent studies in the past 5 years, more recently in 2009, there was a research study that showed that the amount of Americans who believe that marijuana is acceptable or should be acceptable for a personal use or at least medicinal use has increased to 86% of Americans. We're not going to get into that debate right here, not yet. Also, culture-specific modules, cultural stereotyping. Certain cultures use certain drugs per se. We see this widely with African Americans and the stereotypes that only African Americans are the ones who fall prey or victim to crack. We see this with the certain areas of different areas where methamphetamine in the Asian population, or what we see as ice, and certain different types of drugs where there is a cultural specific stereotyping as far as that one culture would be more prone to fall into addiction, and it's really less of a cultural thing and more of a demographic or a societal thing. They address diversity issues in counseling. It's definitely important to know your client's background and your client's ethnic upbringing. Of course, there are different, different ways that your client's background will meet up and match up, and it's always been taught to me, and it's always been the way that I have known that matching clients, if you can match a female client with a female counselor, if you have the ability to do so, and if you can match a Caucasian client with a Caucasian counselor, or an African American client with an African American client, there will be, in many cases, an ability for there to be a connection there based on just sociocultural connectiveness. Now, that's not to say that that's what should be done in every case. In some cases, that type of matching is helpful in the client's treatment process, and treatment directors will do the best that they can in that type of matching. Subcultural models, sociological and environmental causes, patterns within certain groups, age, gender, and ethnicity, the different drugs that they were doing in the 70s, which is your baby boomers today, will know about Quaaludes, Mandrex, different other black mollies. If you say that, if you tell someone when you're doing a drug and alcohol evaluation, have you ever done any phenobarbital, or any other type of barbiturate, they're not going to know what you're saying. But if you ask them if they've done any black mollies, any black hornets, or any of the street names, which that drug has really been off the market for about 20 years now, so in popularity, but back in the day, Quaaludes, as they were once known, Quaaludes were very specifically popular, and anyone who's in their late 30s or 40s or even 50s in the class or older will know what I'm talking about with that drug. And for the youngsters, you definitely want to do some research and study on it, because it was the ecstasy of its day back in the 60s and 70s. And so those are things that you have to look at. You want to be careful, though, and when I talk about treatment matching and client, the sociocultural models, you definitely want to be careful of stereotyping clients based on any type of anything that could be a mark on them for what you would assume. If someone comes in and they may look like they're a marijuana smoker, you have to be careful. You want to be careful in any case and not automatically stereotype or assume something. The multi-causal model says no single model explains addiction. There's a syndrome model, which is multiple interacting antecedents, or things that happen, precursors or thought patterns that happen before the actual addiction takes place. The integral model, or the eclectic model, which shows that there's an integrative medicine and transpersonal psychology, which says that medication, therapy, and some type of psychotherapy works best when treating these type of addictions. Similar to public health model, agent, host, and environment, which is more of a holistic way of treating addiction. And finally, here are some useful websites: health.org, mentalhealth.org, NIAAA and SAMHSA, drugabuse.gov, and then NIAAA at National Institute of Health. This concludes our very first lecture. I will be posting another one very soon. Be sure and take notes with the lectures that will aid you on our class projects that are coming up, as well as on your first exam. If you have any questions, be sure and post them in the Questions for Instructor discussion board. I thank you.